First off, I would assume that we all know what we are talking about when we talk about human rights. I don't think I need to spend much time discussing the basic question, what are human rights? We all have a very good idea, I suppose, of what it is about. When we talk about human rights, we are essentially talking about entitlements and claims that we make for ourselves, that we make for other people, simply by reason of their humanity. Entitlements and claims, you might call them rights, which we claim to have, to possess inherently as human beings. Now, that conception of human rights, that claim about human rights, harkens back to those old debates about natural rights, natural law. What is it that we in fact can claim as human beings on the basis of nature? You see this claim in the American Declaration of Independence when it was asserted as a self-evident truth that all men, we understand what that was all about, all men, all human beings are born equal and endowed with certain rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so on and so forth. This was a claim to that idea of rights that we enjoy, we possess, simply by reason of our humanity. But it is not enough to stop there, because in the context of the modern political communities in which we organize our lives and in which we are organized, we need mechanisms not only to protect those rights that we claim, but also to ensure that those rights, when violated, are given appropriate and sufficient remedy. And in order to do that, political communities have developed the mechanism of encoding or legislating or incorporating these rights that we claim to appear as part of our constitutional and legal frameworks. So we go on to say that, in fact, in order to properly talk about the enjoyment of human rights, we must also ask whether, in fact, these rights that we claim are contained in constitutions, in legislation, and various other legislative decrees, et cetera, In the context of the United States, we talk about the protections that we enjoy under the US Constitution. And by the US Constitution, I mean the original document and all the various amendments that have been adopted over the years. And in the US, the language that we normally use when we talk about these things is a language of civil liberties and freedoms, which is the same thing as human rights. Now, I'm not going to be talking about human rights in the US as such. In other words, the protection of human rights at the national level in the United States today, that can be a topic for another day, although we'll come back to that later on when I talk about linking up the global and the local towards the end of the presentation. I want to talk about human rights in the international context. And so in the language, in the discourse of human rights, we distinguish between national human rights systems protected by constitutions and national legislation, et cetera, in every municipal or state jurisdiction in every country. And we talk about the international human rights system. Now, for the international human rights system, we have to look at the various instruments, legal instruments that have been adopted by states collectively under the auspices of the United Nations to recognize, to articulate, to protect, to promote these various human rights. Some of these coincide with our own national legal frameworks, but others go beyond that. So when we talk about the international human rights system for the protection of human rights, the starting point is in fact the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Or you might actually say the starting point is the United Nations Charter, which was adopted in 1945 at the end of the Second World War to reorganize the ordering of international society and so on, to replace the League of Nations, which had failed as an organization and which had not been able to stop the occurrence of the Second World War. The United Nations was born out of the ashes of the devastation of Europe and the Holocaust. And so it was inevitable that the framers, the founders of the United Nations, who met in San Francisco for months until June of 1945 and adopted the Charter of the United Nations, had foremost in their minds the question, what do we do in order to avoid the scourge of war that has devastated humanity twice in recent years? And you see those words actually appearing in the very first line of the preamble to the United Nations Charter, that the organization was set up in order to stop and prevent the occurrence or the recurrence of war that had already devastated humanity and so on. And at the top most of that list of issues that needed to be done was to address the issue of the genocide that had occurred, the Holocaust, and also to prepare ground for the adoption of instruments that would collectively address issues of human rights going forward. The Charter itself does not contain much in terms of provisions relating to human rights, other than in Articles 1, where it talks about fundamental rights and freedoms of all people in the world, and later in Articles 55 and 56, where it lays out the machinery for elaborating a human rights normative system for the world. And it was in pursuit of those provisions, Articles 55 and 56, that the United Nations established a commission on human rights to draft the instrument that we now call the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, some of you may already be aware of the role that the United States played in this, because that commission was headed by the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt is celebrated as indeed the founding mother of our international human rights system today, because her commission, which comprised representatives from various continents, from South America, from Canada, from Europe, France, from the Middle East, Lebanon, from China, and so on, produced this instrument, the declaration, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly on December 10th, 1948. But that declaration was not meant to be adopted as a treaty. It is not a treaty. So the result is that no country had to sign it. It was simply adopted by vote with 10 abstentions, but the majority of the states at the time that were members of the UN, the 58 countries that were members of the UN, 48 voted in favor of the declaration. What the declaration does, however, is that it sets out a basic framework of the rights that the Commission thought needed to be recognized and protected. Because it was a non-binding instrument, it soon became necessary to negotiate proper treaties that would be actually binding on states. And these treaties start off with what are called the international covenants. So you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Both of these were adopted in 1966, building upon the provisions of the Universal Declaration. Now, the Universal Declaration itself contains 30 provisions. Most of those are provisions that articulated what you would call the classical Western liberal democratic conception of rights, i.e., a focus on the individual, a focus on civil and political rights. So freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, and so on and so forth. There wasn't much agreement about the economic, social, and cultural rights. These would be rights like the right to education, the right to health, right, the right to social security, the right to housing, because there was a disjuncture between the delegates and also in the General Assembly at large as to whether or not this whole list or litany of so-called rights actually ought to be recognized and acknowledged as rights at the same level of normativity. And it wouldn't surprise you to know that by and large, Western countries resisted the idea of incorporating economic and social rights as human rights in this document. And it is partly for that reason that in the end, the decision was, rather than adopt and present the Universal Declaration as a treaty to be signed and ratified by states, which was going to lead to problems, rather divide the issues and have one treaty focusing on civil and political rights and another focusing on economic, social, and cultural rights. And then you'd leave it to states to choose whether to sign up to and ratify one or the other or both, depending on their political and ideological perspectives and approaches, et cetera, et cetera. Suffice to say that the United States is a party to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It has never ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And I might ask you, why is this the case? Well, part of the answer is the obvious one that I have just pointed out. The resistance from the US perspective, from the US political and ideological perspective, the resistance against the recognition of economic and social rights as rights properly or strictly speaking. And we see this resistance even today when people fight about healthcare. Is healthcare a right or a privilege? Is education a right or a privilege? And so on and so forth. Now, I must say that this debate is really, in a sense, unique to the US among Western industrialized countries, because every other Western industrialized country other than the US has actually signed up to and ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These are no longer debates in Europe or elsewhere in the world. Conversely, you find a country like China, which was quick to sign up to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but has not ratified the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Again, for the obvious reason that the ideological schema of things there is one that favors the promotion of what they call the common good, the communistic approach to welfare, which is we must empower people economically and so on, rather than worry about giving them the right to vote, et cetera, as the saying goes, what good is the right to vote to somebody who is illiterate and who has no idea how to make sense of the political debates that are being advanced by politicians, et cetera? Or what good does it do to a hungry person to say they have freedom of association when they have no food and no shelter to put above their heads and that of their family members. So these are debates that have continued to go on. But to close out this, I'll just say this, that in international human rights law, we talk about an international Bill of Rights, which is the equivalent of what would be a constitutional Bill of Rights within our own countries. But in international law, this is the three instruments: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, together with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This provides us the framework for international human rights, but there have also been subsequent treaties that have been adopted following these international covenants. And these subsequent treaties are treaties that are called the core human rights treaties. But before I talk about those core human rights treaties, just to point out to you, as you can see on the screen there, that there are two important treaties that are not included in the description of core human rights treaties, but they are in fact part of the corpus of international human rights law. Because these treaties were adopted prior to the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or immediately afterwards, in the case of the Convention on Refugees. So you see there, the Convention for the Prevention, or on the Prevention rather, and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Genocide Convention of 1948, which is relevant to our discussions this week because it provides the international legal basis for these discussions of what constitutes genocide and what ought to be done when we identify the commission of a genocide in a particular country, et cetera, et cetera. It is also important because in the context of my discussion later on about the Rohingya situation, I will remind you that among the 5 human rights instruments that Myanmar or Burma is a party to is the Genocide Convention. And then you have the other treaty, which is relevant to the United States, and the US is a party both to the Genocide Convention and this other one, which is the Convention relating to the status of refugees, which was adopted in 1951, initially to address the problem of the refugee migrations coming out of Europe after the war, after the Second World War. And this convention, although initially limited in geographical scope to Europe and limited in time, temporal limitation, because it only applied to people who had been recognized as refugees as from a particular date, has subsequently been expanded by protocols and so on to address the refugee situation worldwide. And the refugee situation is one that we are quite familiar with. So what are the other conventions? I indicated that I list these just for your information, not to be discussed as such. But you see that among those that the US has ratified is a convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. What does that mean for debates about racial discrimination here at home? The Convention Against Torture, to which the US is a party. What does that mean for debates that are still going on about Guantanamo Bay, et cetera, et cetera? Do we torture or do we not torture? And what constitutes torture, et cetera? These are issues that you might want to reflect upon later. But notice the instruments that the US has not ratified. It's not a party. As I said earlier, the one on economic, social, and cultural rights. Surprisingly, perhaps, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The United States is one of only 6 countries, alongside countries like Bhutan, Iran, and so on, that is not a party to this convention. Why is that the case? The Convention on the Rights of the Child. You would have thought that the US, as a leader in the international human rights movement, would in fact be leading by example and ratifying these particular treaties on women's rights, on the rights of children, etc., or indeed the most recent, the Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities. What does this mean for our fight against discrimination against such groups, etc., etc.? Now, there are complicated arguments. One of the arguments, of course, is that, well, we don't need to ratify these treaties because our own constitutional protections in the US and our own legal framework takes care of these groups. But there is a set of counter arguments, and some of the reasons are reasons that I cannot go into detail now, but for the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the US has issues with apparently provisions that might be interpreted as allowing the right to abortion, reproductive rights, provisions that call upon states to recognize equality of treatment in terms of pay, equal pay, in terms of social services or social welfare, including childcare, et cetera, for obvious reasons, this has not met with approval in the United States political environment. Convention on the Rights of the Child, there are provisions there that might impact the ability of some states to recruit people under a certain age to fight in the military. And so states have all sorts of reasons for not wanting to commit to some of those kinds of obligations, etc. But the crucial issue here, again, in the context of Myanmar or Burma, is that as far as Myanmar is concerned, it has ratified these 4 treaties, economic, social, and cultural rights. It has ratified the Convention on Women's Rights. It has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and most recently, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But more crucially, as I said earlier, it also has ratified the Genocide Convention. So what does this mean? Well, it means this, that when we talk about international human rights law, we must look at which treaties a particular state is a party to. In other words, which instruments has it signed and ratified in accordance with its own constitutional procedures and so on and so forth. And in the United States, the ratification of treaties so that they become binding on the US is a process that involves the advice and consent by Senate. Absent that advice and consent by Senate, the United States president cannot ratify a treaty. And so the ones that the US has signed but have not been ratified are lying out there in the State Department. They have been since the days of Jimmy Carter, since the days of George Herbert Walker Bush, and so on, all the way through to the presidencies of Clinton. Treaties that the US has signed, but the president of the day has not been able or has not mustered the necessary political support to feel confident enough to take the treaty to Senate for advice and consent. In some cases where this has been done, for example, in relation to the Convention on the Rights of Women, the treaty has been killed, sorry to use that language, in the Foreign Relations Committee. Arguments about, well, these treaties adopted under the auspices of the UN are impinging upon US sovereignty. We don't need these treaties because we have got the necessary protections within our constitution and within our law, et cetera, et cetera. Countries like Myanmar also use the same arguments sometimes, but in some cases, it is just outright opposition to what the treaty in question purports to provide. But even where a state has not ratified a particular treaty in international human rights law, it doesn't mean that the state is not bound by certain or some aspects of international human rights. Because we also in international law talk about the rules and principles of customary international law as being part of the sources of law. Now, international human rights law means that some of these treaties, though not ratified by a particular state, may have created a practice that is systematically followed by states over a period of time, such that some aspects of those treaties morph into customary international, in which case they will bind even countries that may not necessarily have subscribed to the particular treaty. So the binding effect there is not as a result of ratifying the treaty, but as a result of the rules in question having morphed into customary international law. Customary international law simply signifies those aspects of state practice that give rise to the emergence of rules, and some of these rules become binding. And in the context of customary international law, there are certain rules relating to certain acts, for example, the prohibition of slavery, the prohibition of torture, the prohibition of war crimes or crimes against humanity, the right to self-determination, et cetera, Those are rules that are regarded as part of customary international law, and they're regarded by the international community as so fundamental that no state can unilaterally claim that it is not bound by those rules. And these are rules that we call rules of jus cogens. You'll find some of the slides, a couple of slides in Slack that talk about this. Today, we talk about the human rights situation, and I'll just give you this snapshot to prepare the ground for zooming in on the issue of genocide. So if I asked you, what do you think are the burning issues about human rights today? Well, it wouldn't be possible to exhaust these issues. It would be probably futile to try and draw up an exhaustive list of what you might call human rights issues that are going on today. But among the more prominent ones are issues that I have listed in these slides. And so we start off with the issue of human trafficking. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, there's been an exponential increase in the global trend since 2010. In other words, in the past decade, every year has seen more and more people being trafficked across borders, even across continents. And this has coincided with the prevalence of conflict in various parts of the world. Right now, the most dangerous parts of the world, as far as human trafficking is concerned, are the Middle East, obviously because of the situation in Syria and earlier Iraq, and North Africa, because of the lawlessness and the chaos that followed the removal of Gaddafi and his regime. But we also see human trafficking from across South America into Central and on to North America. So part of the issue about migration, et cetera, is also an issue in which human traffickers are taking advantage of situations. Women and children are the most obvious victims of this trafficking. And at the moment, Libya, in fact, has been pointed out as the worst case, where it's not just a question of trafficking, but also the emergence of modern slavery in Libya, where people who come to Libya hoping to jump on a boat across the Mediterranean into Europe are stuck and trapped in these situations of slavery. That links up to the refugee crisis. The latest refugees, And the difference, of course, between a refugee and a displaced person is that the refugee is the one who has been lucky enough, quote unquote, to cross the border into another country and seek refuge or apply for asylum. Displaced persons are trapped within their own countries, and often they are even in a more perilous situation than those who have managed to get refugee status, or at least get the protection of UNHCR across the border in another country. Myanmar accounts for 1.1 million refugees, and about 1 million of these are in Bangladesh, itself a poor country and itself in need of help. As a matter of fact, out of the 26.4 million refugees worldwide, 86% of these refugees are actually hosted by countries in the developing world. In other words, underdeveloped countries. Only 14% are hosted by countries in developed countries in the West. We talk so much about refugees when in fact we are talking about thousands of refugees, when poor countries are hosting millions of refugees, like Bangladesh. Venezuela alone accounts for 3.9 million displaced persons, almost 4 million, of which 1.1 million are being hosted by Colombia, which can hardly afford to look after these displaced persons and so on. So that gives you a scale of the problem and also a perspective when we in the developed, rich global north complain about being swamped by refugees and migrants, forgetting that in fact, by far the great majority of these are actually being taken care of or are forced to encamp in poor countries in the global south. Gender equality is another issue that is not getting better. The Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women has been ratified by 189 countries. As I said, the United States is not one of those. 189 countries out of 193 members of the United Nations. On paper, that will give you the impression that in fact, the great majority of humanity understands the imperative of gender equality, understands the need to ensure equality between men and women and people of other genders, et cetera, but that is not the case. Because the convention requires states to undertake certain administrative and legislative measures to bring their obligations in line with their own legislations in the municipal sphere. And in a lot of countries, that has not happened. Countries pay lip service to this, but you still see inequality between men and women in terms of lack of access to education, political representation, reproductive rights, which I mentioned earlier on, access to economic opportunities, and tied again to the issue of human trafficking, migration and refugee movements, the issue of sexual and gender-based violence. We are reading now reports of such violence in the border areas in the south between Mexico and the United States. Women and children being subjected to levels of sexual and gender-based violence, sometimes by the traffickers themselves, but sometimes, as I saw yesterday and today, apparently also by US border officials who are accused in El Paso. Yesterday, a report came out of sexually exploiting some of the minor children who are stuck in a camp there, separated from their parents, et cetera, et cetera. So these are things that we have to deal with here at home. And the final slide on this, I suppose, is just again a reminder about LGBT rights. We sometimes tend to assume that we're making progress, but it seems the more progress we made, the greater the backlash in some countries. So here we've seen attempts to push back against, for example, transgender rights in some schools, in some states, which I need not name, but it's not just in the United States, it's across the world. Today, Hungary is in dispute against the 26 other members of the European Union over its newly enacted law, which makes it a crime to either share information or propagate, or in the context even of education, to young people about LGBT rights, et cetera, et cetera. The law has been described by the European Union as homophobic, and the European Union has issued a statement saying that this does not accord with what we would like to call European values. But Hungary, as we know, has adopted a totally different approach. It is on its own there. For those of you who follow soccer, there is a tournament going on in Europe called the Euro 2020 Championships, 2020 because it should have taken place last year, but it's taking place now. Today, there's going to be a match between Hungary and I think it's Germany in Munich. And the German Football Federation was asked to light up the stadium in rainbow colors. Hungary protested and said they wouldn't play the match if that were done. The organizers of the tournament caved in and said they will not do that, but all other cities in Germany have committed to light up their stadia, although there are no games today in those stadia, to light up their stadia in these rainbow colors to show solidarity with LGBT people. This is happening in Europe. In Europe also, the Vatican is pushing back against Italy. Italy has just proposed a law that will make it a crime to discriminate against people on the basis of their sexuality, to make homophobia a specific offense in Italian law. And the Vatican, at the highest level of the Pope, has reminded Italy that when the state of the Vatican City, which is a sovereign state, by the way, from the point of view of international law, entered into a treaty with Italy, one of the provisions was that the state of Italy would never interfere with the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. It would respect the sovereignty of the Vatican City and the teachings of the church, and that the church is opposed to this law, et cetera, et cetera. But you'd have thought that this is a Pope who has declared not too long ago that he doesn't want to be judgmental about people's sexuality, and yet they're opposing a law that criminalizes homophobia. So I mentioned this just to say it's not unique to certain countries, China, Russia, etc. It is also happening within our midst in the Western countries. Press freedom, attacks of journalists on journalists, etc., is another issue. Racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. 20 years ago, in Durban, South Africa, the United Nations adopted what was called the Durban Plan on Racism, or the Durban Plan of Action and Declaration on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and other forms of intolerance. And that action plan acknowledged past and contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, and so on, against Africans and people of African descent, against Asians and people of Asian descent, indigenous peoples, et cetera, et cetera. And yet we see that this is continuing today. Yesterday at the Human Rights Council session in Geneva, Canada led 41 countries to issue a statement against China for the discrimination that is occurring against the Uyghur community. The Canadian Parliament has already designated the Uyghur situation as a genocide. The Canadian government is also pushing for the Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution that condemns China for its discrimination against the Uyghurs, ethnic minority group. And China pushed back with a statement saying Canada should mind the situation back in Canada. What about the recent story of unmarked graves of Native peoples, of First Nations, children who were taken away from parents over a period of 50 years in Canada and sent to schools in order to culturally, as it were, civilize them, quote unquote. And now we are discovering this. So China is pushing back on that. The Secretary of the Interior, you may be aware here yesterday, perhaps unrelated to what was happening in Geneva, Secretary Haaland has issued a departmental memo initiating an inquiry into the situation of children of Native Americans who were taken away to Indian schools. And those of us in Pennsylvania here will remember that Carlisle had one such Indian school. And the issue is, and Secretary Haaland actually refers to the Canadian situation, to investigate and find out, one, what happened in these situations. Secondly, issues of children that died in these schools and were buried in unmarked and acknowledged cemeteries or graves, and the impact that the survivors of this program of taking away children in order to put them in boarding schools, etc., away from their families and communities, the impact, the lasting impact of the experience on survivors on today's generations, etc., etc. So again, already, even before I come towards the end of my presentation, we are seeing here the connections that are playing out between what is happening globally and what is happening here at home. The issue of global health, the pandemic, has in fact become another fissure and another fault line in human rights protections and violations. Attacks on LGBT people in countries like Uganda under the guise of implementing COVID control measures, et cetera, attacks on rural urban migrants in India, blaming them for the virus, when in fact, it is the other way around. People are probably picking up the COVID viruses in the urban areas rather than bringing it in from the rural areas. Other countries are putting up tougher immigration policies using the pretext of COVID control measures, etc. Censorship of journalists in places like Tanzania, China. Today, the most pro-democratic newspaper in Hong Kong, the Apple Daily, has announced that it is closing down for good. Its proprietor, Jimmy Lai, is in prison, has been sentenced to 6 months, might be sentenced to life, later on accused of breaching national security laws and so on. Journalists were rounded up at the beginning of the week. The paper is closing down because its bank accounts have been frozen. But part of the problem there is not because the newspaper has been very critical about democracy, but the paper has been reporting alone among Chinese papers on issues relating to questions about the coronavirus, the questions that people are raising as to what China did or did not do, et cetera, et cetera. So they want to shut them up. The use of invasive technology, invasive tracking apps in South Korea, China, and other places, and whether or not they impinge upon privacy rights. So those are just some of the issues. I haven't talked about climate and human rights. I haven't talked about various other issues that affect the human rights situation today. But I want to end by then zooming in on this issue of genocide, because at the end of all this, we are talking about the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights education. And I think one of the things that we might want to look at as we go back to our conversations with our students in our schools is whether or not the world is doing enough, has done enough, not only to identify situations of ongoing genocides, but situations of potential genocides. And how do we get young people to understand what a genocide is really about and how to identify it when it occurs? But secondly, also the issue of memory, because genocides are not often acknowledged as they occur. People ignore them. The Rwanda genocide was ignored as it was occurring. The Clinton administration advised American diplomats not to use the term genocide in relation to what was going on in Rwanda. Why? Because doing so would have invoked certain obligations under the Genocide Convention. State parties to the Genocide Convention have obligations to do something to prevent or stop a genocide and to commit to punish people who are involved in the genocide. And the Clinton administration preferred to just describe Rwanda initially as, this tribal warfare in Africa. It's not a genocide. If you think I'm making it up, read the book by Samantha Parks, A Problem from Hell, where she talks about her experiences as a diplomat, talks about Bosnia, but also talks about Rwanda. Today, nobody doubts that Rwanda was a genocide, and the US administration admitted as such afterwards. But it is not always so. A genocide that occurred 100 years ago in Southwest Africa, Namibia, under German colonization, was denied for 100 years by successive German administrations, governments. Only 3 weeks ago did Germany finally admit that it had committed genocide in Namibia, and they have agreed with the Namibian government on the reparations, et cetera, but the issue is still going on because now it's an argument about the reparations. It was only 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago maybe, that President Biden admitted that what happened in Armenia was a genocide. And again, previous presidents, his predecessors, had shied away from making that formal acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. So I think it is important to talk about these things because we don't want to wait until 100 years from now to turn around and say, oh yes, what was happening in Myanmar was actually a genocide of the Rohingyas. So I will not go through these slides. I provided them just for the background information and so on. But I will just say this, that over the past 40 or 50 years, pretty much since 1962, there have been systematic attacks on certain minorities in Myanmar, and most recently, attacks on the Rohingya community. And these attacks have included arbitrary killings, forced dislocations, prolonged arbitrary detention, and so on. You'll see that list of violations there. Well, these violations in Myanmar are not based, or the accusations of these violations is not based on the fact that Myanmar has signed these treaties, but as I said, partly based on customary international law. Although those that are captured in the Genocide Convention are based on Myanmar's status as a party to the Genocide Convention. So irrespective of the fact that Myanmar is a signatory to only 5 human rights instruments, we can still say Myanmar has witnessed systematic violations of human rights as recognized generally under international law. The issue of genocide in Myanmar, the Trump administration considered this. Secretary Pompeo was under pressure to make a genocide determination and proclaim that Myanmar was committing a genocide. There was divided opinion in the State Department among the lawyers and advisors. The State Department went out of its way to engage external lawyers, professors of human rights, international law, political scientists, and so on to advise it. And there is a divide there. Some said it was a genocide, others said no. But what is interesting is that on his last day in office, Secretary Pompeo proceeded to declare what was happening in China as a genocide, while refusing to make a similar declaration on Myanmar. President Biden, I beg your pardon, has asked Secretary Blinken to review this Myanmar situation, and apparently it is still under review. We await the declaration that will come out, whether it will be a determination that Myanmar, in fact, is committing a genocide or that it is not. So that brings up the question, because as I said, there are a number of situations that have been recognized as modern genocides. Will Myanmar be part of that? Why should this be the case? One, in terms of the contested characterizations, Myanmar is clearly a situation in which a particular ethnic group, which is both an ethnic and religious, i.e. Muslim minority group, is the subject of systematic violations. And some of these violations, some of these acts are acts that in fact fall under the acts stipulated in Article 5 of the Genocide Convention. And what are these? That these are acts of violence committed against a protected group, i.e. the Rohingya, with intent to destroy this group, either in whole or in part. And the Genocide Convention prohibits a range of things: direct commission of these acts, engaging in conspiracies to commit these acts, publicly inciting others, etc., etc. There is no doubt about the acts that are being committed, which fall under the Genocide Convention. So killing members of the group, causing bodily and mental harm to the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring out its physical destruction, etc., forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, or imposing measures to prevent birth within the group. When you go through the information I have provided in the slides, you see that Myanmar, starting in 1982, for example, enacted legislation, what they call the law of citizenship, which in fact denies the very existence of this group. It doesn't acknowledge them as an ethnic group within the country. That law has been used as an anchor to subject the Rohingyas to other systematic violations, denial of economic opportunities, socioeconomic rights, and so on and so forth. Forcible transfers and forcible migration. I've talked about the migration or forced migration of 1 million people from Myanmar to Bangladesh, fleeing because their livelihoods are being destroyed, because their villages, their places of habitation are being destroyed, and so on, as a result of a deliberate policy by government to remove them from these areas. Now, forcible removal is not in itself a crime under the Genocide Convention, but forcible removal can in fact be a predicate to a genocide. Because if that forcible removal is accompanied by the intention to exterminate this group, or to ensure that this group does not exist anymore within a particular geographical area, you are basically engaging on a genocidal intent. And this is where the argument is. Now, the facts are not in dispute because commissions of inquiry have been sent to Myanmar, including by the Human Rights Commission. On Monday, the Human Rights Commission again brought up the issue of Myanmar and demanded that the High Commissioner for Human Rights be allowed to visit Myanmar or be allowed to send representatives. The same thing with regard to China, that the Human Rights Commissioner be allowed to visit Xinjiang province to investigate the situation of the Uyghurs, etc., etc. So I would suggest this, that there is evidence, factual evidence of systematic violations that in fact are captured within the definition of the prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention. I would suggest that although it is difficult to impute intent to a state as an inanimate entity, if we can show that there is some level of deliberate policy at government level to do what is being done to the Myanmar community in order to eliminate it, that might go towards proving a case for the commission of genocide by the military regime in Myanmar. The irony of all this is that one of the defendants of Myanmar against the charges of genocide was none other than Aung San Suu Kyi, who, as we know now, is under arrest, being charged with all sorts of strange criminal offenses. Obviously, the intention is that the new military government wants to exclude her from participation in politics because her party won the last elections in November 2020. On the 1st of February, the military came back and took power. She was leading the defense team at the International Court of Justice, which was at the Court of Justice to defend Myanmar against the claims of genocide being committed there. This is a case which was brought by the small West African state called the Gambia, because any country that is a party to the Genocide Convention can invoke the Genocide Convention to bring up a case before a tribunal if it alleges that genocide is being committed by the regime or by individuals in that particular state. And so the Gambia, representing as it were humanity, brought out this case. And Aung San Suu Kyi, Nobel Prize winner, previous champion of human rights in Myanmar, turns out to be the one defending the military who later overthrew her and saying there is no genocide in Myanmar. I make this point just to say that there is a lot that the world can do, and the world can do a lot by pushing the UN Security Council, which has so far failed to invoke its own principle of the responsibility to protect, because China and Russia, since 2007, have systematically pushed back in the Security Council for the adoption of a resolution to allow foreign intervention in Myanmar to stop or prevent the occurrence of genocide. There are political reasons for that. And as you know, the Security Council cannot take a decision and authorize anything unless all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, China, the US, France, and the United Kingdom, agree to that resolution. If any one of them vetoes the resolution, then no decision can be taken. And this is where we are with Myanmar. I think a genocide is taking place. The UN has been unable to intervene. The UN has been paralyzed, so to speak. And the only option that was available was a small state like the Gambia to go to the International Court of Justice and institute proceedings. Myanmar was given 4 months to bring back a report to the court committing to stopping further genocidal acts pending future discussion of the merits of the case. What can we take away from this? What we can take away is that for us as educators, as teachers of human rights, we need to think about these things that are happening out there and try to connect them to the local. How do we get our students to understand these complicated issues of violations of human rights, genocides, et cetera, et cetera? This is a discussion that we can have another time. I believe in February, I'm going to have a discussion with you on navigating human rights education. Then I'll go into detail about what we as human rights educators understand human rights education to be, how we can engage with our students and young people in the classroom, and what action they can take out of the classroom into the human rights world. So I'll stop there.